Picture this. You're standing in a crowded military training facility, watching what seems like a complete mismatch. On one side, three massive Marine Corps black belts, their muscles rippling under their training gear, laughing and flexing as they circle around their target. On the other side stands a woman who barely reaches their shoulders, her quiet demeanor making her appear almost fragile in comparison. The Marines are loud, confident, practically shouting challenges across the room. "Come on, lady. You sure you want to do this?" One of them calls out, his voice dripping with arrogance. His buddies chuckle, already planning their victory celebration. But here's what they don't know. What nobody in that room knows except for the woman's commanding officer, who's watching from the corner with a slight smile on his face. The person they're about to face isn't just any service member. She's not even just any fighter. She's someone whose hands have been registered as lethal weapons. Someone who has spent years perfecting an ancient art that turns the human body into the ultimate fighting machine. Someone who has faced enemies in the darkest corners of the world and emerged victorious every single time. The Marines see a small woman. What they're actually looking at is a walking, breathing weapon of mass destruction wrapped in a deceptively calm exterior. In the next few minutes, these three tough-as-nails Marines are about to learn a lesson they'll never forget. They're about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous opponents come in the most unexpected packages. This is the true story of Lieutenant Sarah Chun, Navy SEAL and 7th degree black belt in Shotokan Karate. And the day she turned a routine training exercise into a masterclass in humility, respect, and the true meaning of martial arts mastery. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had always been different. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, she was the daughter of a Chinese father who owned a local restaurant and an Irish mother who worked as a school teacher. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 130 pounds, Sarah had learned early in life that size meant nothing when it came to determination and skill. Her journey into martial arts began when she was just 7 years old. Her father, David Chun, had been a martial arts instructor in Taiwan before immigrating to America. He noticed that his young daughter was being bullied at school for being different, for looking Asian in a predominantly white community. Instead of telling her to ignore the bullies or asking the school to handle it, David made a decision that would change Sarah's life forever. "Sarah," he told her one evening after she came home with a torn backpack and tears in her eyes, "tomorrow we begin your real education." The next day, David took Sarah to the basement of their house, which he had converted into a small dojo years earlier, but rarely used. The room smelled of old wood and discipline. Traditional weapons hung on the walls, and a large mirror reflected their movements as David began teaching his daughter the ancient art of Shotokan Karate. Karate is not about fighting, David explained as he showed Sarah the basic stance. It is about discipline, respect, and inner strength. The physical techniques are just the surface. The real power comes from here, he said, pointing to his heart, and here, pointing to his head. Sarah proved to be a natural student. Her small frame allowed her to move with incredible speed and agility, while her determined personality meant she practiced for hours beyond what her father required. By age 10, she had earned her first black belt. By 15, she held a 3rd-degree black belt and was competing in national tournaments. But Sarah's interests extended beyond martial arts. She was an excellent student, graduating as valedictorian of her high school class. However, instead of accepting the full scholarship to Stanford University that was offered to her, Sarah shocked everyone by announcing her intention to join the military. "Why would you throw away your future like this?" her mother asked, tears streaming down her face. "You could become a doctor, a lawyer, anything you want." Sarah's answer was simple but profound. "I want to serve something bigger than myself. I want to protect people who can't protect themselves." Her father understood. He had seen the warrior spirit growing in his daughter over the years, the way she approached every challenge with unwavering determination. He also knew that traditional martial arts had given her something most people never develop, the ability to remain calm and focused under extreme pressure. Sarah enlisted in the Navy immediately after graduation. Her plan was to become a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite special operations forces in the world. What she didn't know was that she would become one of the first women ever to successfully complete SEAL training. The training was brutal beyond anything most people could imagine. Candidates were pushed to their absolute physical and mental limits, with dropout rates exceeding 75%. The instructors seemed determined to break every recruit, using psychological warfare, sleep deprivation, and physical challenges that bordered on superhuman. Sarah's martial arts background served her well during this period. While other candidates relied purely on physical strength or mental toughness, Sarah had spent years developing both simultaneously. When instructors made them hold heavy logs above their heads until their arms felt like they would fall off, Sarah used meditation techniques she had learned in karate to separate her mind from the physical discomfort. During the infamous Hell Week, a 5-day period where candidates get less than 4 hours of sleep total while enduring constant physical challenges, Sarah's small size actually became an advantage. She could move through obstacle courses faster than larger candidates, required less food to maintain her energy, and her low center of gravity made her more stable during water exercises. But it was during the combat training phase that Sarah truly began to stand out. The instructors would pit candidates against each other in hand-to-hand combat scenarios, expecting to see raw, aggressive fighting. Instead, they watched in amazement as this small woman systematically dismantled opponents twice her size using precise, controlled techniques. "Chun," barked Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez after watching Sarah defeat 3 larger candidates in succession. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "My father taught me karate, Chief," Sarah replied respectfully. Rodriguez had been a SEAL for 15 years and had seen his share of tough fighters. But there was something different about the way Sarah moved, the way she could anticipate her opponent's attacks and respond with devastating efficiency. "Well, keep it up," Rodriguez said with approval. "The teams need fighters who can think as well as they can hit." Sarah graduated from SEAL training as the honor graduate of her class, the first woman ever to achieve that distinction. Her instructors noted in her file that she possessed exceptional tactical awareness, superior hand-to-hand combat skills, and the unique ability to maintain operational effectiveness under extreme stress. Following graduation, Sarah was assigned to SEAL Team 7, based in Coronado, California. Her first deployment took her to Afghanistan, where she participated in numerous high-risk missions in hostile territory. Her martial arts skills proved invaluable in close-quarters combat situations where firearms couldn't be used due to the risk of alerting nearby enemies. During one particularly dangerous mission, Sarah's unit was tasked with capturing a high-value target in a compound in Kandahar province. The operation required them to eliminate sentries silently before moving to the primary objective. While her teammates relied on knives and other weapons for silent kills, Sarah used her karate training to incapacitate guards with precise strikes that rendered them unconscious without causing permanent injury. "It's like watching a ninja," whispered Petty Officer First Class Martinez as he watched Sarah take down a guard twice her size with a single, perfectly placed strike to a pressure point on a man's neck. The mission was a complete success, with the target captured and no casualties on either side. Sarah's ability to neutralize threats without lethal force whenever possible earned her respect from her teammates and superiors alike. Over the next 3 years, Sarah participated in dozens of successful operations across multiple theaters. She earned commendations for valor, leadership, and tactical excellence. Her personnel file contained glowing reviews from every commanding officer she had served under. But it was her continued dedication to martial arts that truly set Sarah apart from her peers. Even while deployed in combat zones, she found time to practice her forms and techniques. She had continued her karate training through correspondence with masters in Japan, eventually earning her 7th-degree black belt through a combination of video submissions, written examinations, and practical demonstrations when she was stateside. Her teammates often gathered to watch her practice, amazed by the fluid precision of her movements. To them, it looked like a deadly dance, each motion flowing seamlessly into the next with purpose and control that spoke to years of dedicated training. "Chun, you got to teach us some of that stuff," Martinez said one evening after watching her practice kata in their temporary base camp. Sarah always declined these requests politely. "Karate isn't something you can learn in a few lessons," she would explain. "It takes years to develop the foundation, and even longer to truly understand the principles behind the techniques." It was during her second deployment to Afghanistan that Sarah received the news that would change her career trajectory. She was being reassigned to a joint training facility in Virginia, where she would help develop new close-quarters combat protocols for Special Operations Forces. The assignment was a recognition of her unique skills and tactical knowledge. The facility, known as the Joint Special Operations Training Center, was where elite forces from all branches of the military came to train together and share expertise. It was here that the incident with the Marines would occur, an event that would become legendary among military personnel. Sarah arrived at the facility on a humid Tuesday morning in July. The complex was impressive, featuring state-of-the-art training equipment, simulation rooms, and multiple combat training areas. Her new commanding officer, Commander James Patterson, gave her a tour of the facilities and explained her role. "Chun, you're here because you've demonstrated exceptional hand-to-hand combat capabilities in real-world situations," Patterson explained as they walked through the main training hall. "We want you to help us develop new training protocols and also serve as an instructor for advanced close-quarters combat techniques." The training hall was buzzing with activity. Marines, Army Rangers, Air Force Special Operations personnel, and other SEALs were engaged in various training exercises. Sarah observed their techniques with a critical eye, noting areas where improvements could be made. Most of these guys rely too heavily on brute strength, she thought to herself as she watched a group of Marines practicing grappling techniques. They're not using their opponent's energy against them. It was then that she noticed 3 Marines in particular who seemed to be dominating every exercise they participated in. They were all large men, clearly in excellent physical condition, and they moved with the confidence that comes from years of successful training and combat experience. Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson was the leader of the group. At 6 feet 3 inches and 220 pounds of solid muscle, he had been a Marine for 8 years and held a third-degree black belt in mixed martial arts. His reputation as a fighter was well known throughout the Corps, and he had never lost a sparring match during his entire military career. Corporal James Wilson was Thompson's frequent training partner. Slightly shorter but equally muscular, Wilson was known for his aggressive fighting style and devastating punching power. He had been the heavyweight boxing champion of his unit for 3 consecutive years. The third member of the group was Lance Corporal David Chong. Despite his Asian heritage, Chong had grown up in inner-city Detroit and learned to fight on the streets before refining his techniques in the military. He was the fastest of the 3 and specialized in submission holds and joint locks. As Sarah watched them train, she could see that they were skilled fighters by military standards. They were strong, fast, and aggressive. But she also noticed fundamental flaws in their technique that could be exploited by someone with proper martial arts training. They telegraph their punches, Sarah observed mentally. Their stance is too wide for quick direction changes, and they commit too much to each attack. Commander Patterson noticed Sarah studying the Marines. "Those are some of our best fighters," he said with pride. "Thompson, Wilson, and Chong. They've been training together for 2 years and have never lost a team sparring session." Sarah nodded politely, but didn't comment. She had learned long ago that it was better to observe and analyze quietly rather than make premature judgments. After completing her orientation, Sarah was assigned quarters in the visiting officer barracks and told to report the next morning for her first training session. She would be observing various classes and beginning to formulate ideas for the new training protocols she had been brought in to develop. That evening, Sarah unpacked her belongings in her small but comfortable room. Among her few possessions were several karate uniforms, traditional weapons that she used for forms practice, and a collection of books on martial arts philosophy and technique. She had learned to travel light during her military career, but these items were essential to maintaining her connection to the art that had shaped her life. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the challenges that lay ahead. She knew that being one of the few women in an overwhelmingly male environment would present unique difficulties. She also understood that her small stature would cause many people to underestimate her capabilities. But Sarah had faced skepticism and doubt throughout her military career, and she had always proven herself through actions rather than words. She was confident in her abilities and secure in the knowledge that true martial arts mastery had little to do with physical size or gender. What Sarah couldn't anticipate was that her first real test at the facility would come much sooner than expected, and in a way that would challenge not just her fighting skills, but her ability to maintain the principles of respect and humility that her father had taught her so many years ago. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become the stuff of military legend, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous opponents come in the most unexpected packages. The next morning arrived with a kind of oppressive humidity that made even seasoned military personnel uncomfortable. Sarah woke at 0530, as was her custom, and began her day with a series of traditional karate forms practiced in the small space of her quarters. The flowing movements helped center her mind and prepare her body for whatever challenges the day might bring. After a quick shower and breakfast in the facility's dining hall, Sarah reported to the main training center, where Commander Patterson was waiting with a clipboard and what appeared to be a detailed schedule. "Good morning, Chun," Patterson said with a professional smile. "Today you'll be observing several different training sessions. I want you to take notes on current methodologies, identify potential improvements, and start formulating ideas for the new protocols we discussed." Sarah nodded and followed Patterson into the main training hall. The space was enormous, easily capable of accommodating several hundred personnel simultaneously. Different sections were designated for various types of training: weapons handling, tactical movement, physical fitness, and hand-to-hand combat. "We'll start with the Advanced Combat Techniques class," Patterson explained as they walked toward a corner of the facility where approximately 30 military personnel were gathered around several instructors. "This is where our most experienced fighters come to refine their skills." As they approached the group, Sarah immediately recognized the three Marines she had observed the previous day. Thompson, Wilson, and Chong were positioned near the front of the formation, clearly comfortable in their roles as some of the facility's top fighters. The instructor, a grizzled Army Ranger named Sergeant Major Collins, was demonstrating a series of defensive techniques against knife attacks. Sarah watched with interest as Collins showed the proper way to control an attacker's weapon arm, while simultaneously striking vulnerable targets. "The key to defending against a blade," Collins explained to the group, "is to control the weapon first, neutralize the threat second. Most people make the mistake of focusing on the weapon instead of the person holding it." Sarah found herself silently critiquing the demonstration. Collins was competent and clearly experienced, but his techniques relied heavily on strength and aggressive counterattacks. There was little emphasis on using an attacker's momentum against them or finding the most efficient way to end a confrontation with minimal injury to both parties. As the demonstration continued, Sarah noticed that Thompson was whispering something to his two companions. All three men kept glancing in her direction, and she could see smirks on their faces. It was clear they were discussing her presence, and, based on their expressions, their comments were not particularly respectful. Sarah chose to ignore their attention and focused on the training session. She had dealt with skeptical colleagues throughout her military career and had learned that the best response was professional competence and quiet confidence. After the knife defense demonstration, Sergeant Major Collins called for volunteers to practice the techniques with partners. "I need someone to play the role of the attacker," he announced to the group. Thompson's hand shot up immediately. "Sergeant Major, I volunteer to work with the new SEAL," he said loudly, his voice carrying clearly across the training area. "I think it would be valuable for her to practice these techniques with someone who has real combat experience." The comment drew chuckles from several personnel in the group, including Wilson and Chong. Sarah could feel the eyes of everyone present focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to what was clearly intended as a challenge disguised as a training opportunity. Commander Patterson looked uncomfortable with the situation, but couldn't reasonably object without appearing to show favoritism towards Sarah. Sergeant Major Collins seemed oblivious to the underlying tension and simply nodded his approval. "Excellent idea, Thompson," Collins said. "Chin, are you comfortable with this exercise?" Sarah stepped forward calmly, her expression neutral and professional. "Of course, Sergeant Major. I'm here to observe and participate in whatever training you feel would be beneficial." As Sarah moved toward the center of the training area, she could hear more whispered comments from Thompson's companions. Chong was saying something about showing the Navy how Marines really fight, while Wilson was making predictions about how quickly the exercise would be over. Sarah positioned herself according to Collins's instructions, standing approximately 6 feet away from Thompson while he held a training knife, a rubber replica designed to simulate the weight and feel of a real blade without the obvious safety concerns. "Remember," Collins called out to the group, "the goal is for Chun to practice the defensive techniques we just demonstrated. Thompson, make your attacks realistic but controlled. We're here to train, not to prove anything." Thompson nodded and assumed an aggressive stance, holding the training knife in a reverse grip that immediately told Sarah he had received formal combat training. His posture and positioning indicated someone who was genuinely skilled and dangerous, not just a bully trying to intimidate a smaller opponent. "Ready when you are," Thompson said, his voice carrying a slight edge that suggested he was taking this more seriously than a routine training exercise. Sarah settled into a neutral stance that appeared relaxed to the casual observer, but actually positioned her body to respond quickly in any direction. Her breathing remained calm and controlled, and her eyes focused not on the weapon in Thompson's hand, but on his center of mass and overall body positioning. Collins gave the signal to begin, and Thompson immediately launched into an aggressive attack pattern. He moved with speed and precision, making a series of stabbing and slashing motions that would have been devastating if executed with a real weapon. What happened next surprised everyone present except Sarah herself. Instead of using the defensive techniques that Collins had just demonstrated, Sarah moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. She appeared to barely touch Thompson as she redirected his attacks, using subtle hand movements and body positioning to control his momentum and guide him off balance. The first attack came as a straight thrust towards Sarah's midsection. Rather than blocking or deflecting the strike directly, Sarah stepped slightly to one side, while placing one hand on Thompson's wrist and the other on his elbow. With what looked like minimal effort, she guided his attack past her body while simultaneously moving forward into his side. Thompson found himself overextended and off balance, but before he could recover, Sarah had moved behind him and applied gentle pressure to specific points on his arm and shoulder. The training knife dropped from his suddenly nerveless fingers as temporary paralysis spread through his weapon arm. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Thompson spun around to face Sarah, surprise and confusion evident on his face. "What did you just do to my arm?" he demanded. "Pressure point manipulation," Sarah replied calmly as she stepped back to a neutral position. "The effects are temporary. You should regain full feeling in about 30 seconds. Collins looked stunned. In 15 years of military training, he had never seen anyone neutralize an armed attack so efficiently and with so little apparent effort. The techniques Sarah had used were completely different from anything he had ever encountered. "That was impressive," Collins said slowly. "But let's try it again using the methods we've been teaching here. Thompson, are you ready to continue?" Thompson flexed his arm experimentally and found that the feeling was already returning to his fingers. His expression had changed from confident amusement to serious concentration. Whatever he had expected from this exercise, it wasn't what had just happened. "Yeah, let's go again," Thompson said, retrieving the training knife from the floor. This time, Thompson approached the exercise with much more caution and respect for his opponent. His attacks were more measured and controlled, designed to test Sarah's defenses rather than simply overwhelm her with aggression. Sarah adapted her response accordingly, using more conventional defensive techniques that would be familiar to the observing personnel. However, even when employing standard military combat methods, her execution was flawless and her timing was perfect. She successfully defended against a dozen different attack patterns, each time demonstrating not just the techniques that Collins had taught, but variations and improvements that made the defenses more effective and efficient. "Outstanding work," Collins said as the exercise concluded. "Chun, your defensive capabilities are exceptional. Thompson, good job providing realistic attacks." But Thompson wasn't satisfied with the outcome. Sarah could see in his expression that his pride had been wounded by the ease with which she had neutralized his initial attack. As someone who had built his reputation on being unbeatable in combat training, he was struggling to process what had just happened. As the group broke up to practice the techniques in smaller groups, Thompson approached Sarah with Wilson and Chong flanking him like bodyguards. "That was some fancy stuff you pulled with those pressure points," Thompson said, his voice carrying a challenging undertone. "But that kind of thing only works when someone isn't expecting it. In a real fight, against someone who knows what's coming, those tricks wouldn't be so effective." Sarah remained calm and respectful in her response. "You're absolutely right, Staff Sergeant. The element of surprise is always a significant factor in any combat situation. I was simply using the techniques that felt most natural to me." Chong stepped forward, his aggressive posture making his intentions clear. "Natural to you?" he said with obvious skepticism. "Look, I don't know what kind of martial arts classes you took as a kid, but this is real military combat training. We're not playing around with choreographed moves and wooden boards. Wilson nodded in agreement. Chang's got a point. There's a big difference between knowing some karate moves and being able to handle yourself in actual combat. Sarah could feel the tension building, but she maintained her professional demeanor. She understood that these men were feeling challenged and were responding in the only way they knew how. Rather than escalate the situation, she tried to defuse it. "I have a great deal of respect for your training and experience," Sarah said sincerely. "I'm not here to prove anything or challenge anyone. I'm just trying to do my job and contribute to the mission." But Thompson wasn't ready to let the matter drop. His reputation among his peers was built on being the toughest fighter at any facility where he was stationed, and Sarah's demonstration had undermined that status in front of dozens of witnesses. "I'll tell you what," Thompson said, his voice loud enough for nearby personnel to overhear. "How about we settle this properly? A real sparring match, full contact, no weapons. Just hand-to-hand combat between Marines and Navy. Let's see if all that fancy karate stuff works when someone is actually trying to hurt you." The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone within earshot had stopped their training activities and was watching to see how Sarah would respond. She found herself in an impossible position. Accepting the challenge could be seen as unprofessional and unnecessarily aggressive, but declining might be interpreted as cowardice or an admission that her skills weren't genuine. Commander Patterson, who had been observing from across the training area, quickly moved toward the group. He could sense that the situation was escalating beyond normal training activities and might require command intervention. "Is there a problem here?" Patterson asked as he approached the group, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Thompson immediately shifted to a more respectful military bearing. "No problem, sir. I was just suggesting that Lieutenant Chun and I engage in some additional sparring practice. I thought it might be beneficial for both of us to train with someone from a different branch of service." Patterson looked skeptical, but couldn't find fault with the reasoning as Thompson had presented it. Cross-service training was, after all, one of the primary purposes of the facility. "Chun, are you interested in additional sparring practice?" Patterson asked. Sarah understood that she was being given an opportunity to gracefully decline the challenge without losing face. She also recognized that Patterson was trying to protect her from what might be an unfair confrontation. However, Sarah's martial arts background had taught her that sometimes the best way to avoid a larger conflict is to address the immediate challenge directly. She also knew that declining now would only postpone the inevitable confrontation and might make it worse when it finally occurred. "I would be honored to spar with Staff Sergeant Thompson," Sarah replied formally. "If Sergeant Major Collins approves the exercise and proper safety protocols are followed." Collins had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. As a career military instructor, he understood the dynamics at play and recognized that this was about more than just training. However, he also saw an opportunity to observe advanced combat techniques that might be valuable for future instruction. "I think that's an excellent idea," Collins announced. "Let's set up a proper sparring match with full safety gear and official rules. This could be educational for everyone present." Thompson smiled broadly, confident that he was about to restore his reputation and put the overconfident seal in her place. Wilson and Chong exchanged knowing looks, already planning how they would celebrate their friend's inevitable victory. What none of them understood was that Sarah Chun was not just a Navy SEAL who happened to know some karate. She was a 7th-degree black belt who had spent nearly 2 decades perfecting techniques that had been developed over centuries by warriors whose very survival depended on their effectiveness. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the difference between military combat training and true martial arts mastery. Word of the upcoming sparring match spread through the training facility like wildfire. Within an hour, nearly 100 military personnel from various branches had gathered around the main sparring area, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a professional fighting event than a routine training exercise. Sergeant Major Collins had decided to treat the situation with the formality it deserved. He established official rules, appointed referees, and ensured that proper protective gear was available for both participants. What had begun as a casual challenge between 2 service members was now being conducted with the precision and protocol of an official military demonstration. "This is getting out of hand," Commander Patterson muttered to himself as he watched the crowd continue to grow. He had tried to dissuade both participants from proceeding with the match, but both Thompson and Chun had politely but firmly insisted that they wanted to continue. Patterson found himself in a difficult position. As Sarah's commanding officer, he was responsible for her safety and well-being. However, he also couldn't be seen as showing favoritism or protecting her from challenges that other personnel would be expected to handle independently. Moreover, Patterson had read Sarah's service record thoroughly before her assignment to the facility. He knew about her combat deployments, her commendations for valor, and her reputation for exceptional hand-to-hand combat skills. While he was concerned about the circumstances surrounding this match, he wasn't actually worried about Sarah's ability to handle herself against Thompson. In the locker room, Sarah was methodically preparing for the upcoming confrontation. She had changed into a standard military training uniform and was now performing the stretching and mental preparation routines that she had learned during her years of martial arts training. The meditation techniques her father had taught her were particularly important in situations like this. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, allowing her mind to become calm and clear. She visualized the upcoming match not as a conflict between herself and Thompson, but as an opportunity to demonstrate the principles and techniques that have been passed down to her through generations of martial artists. This is not about winning or losing, Sarah reminded herself silently. This is about maintaining honor, showing respect for the art, and teaching through example. Sarah's approach to combat had always been fundamentally different from that of most military personnel. While her colleagues typically focused on defeating opponents through superior strength, speed, or aggression, Sarah had been trained to see combat as a form of physical dialogue where the goal was to achieve harmony rather than domination. This philosophical difference didn't make her less effective as a fighter, quite the opposite. By focusing on balance, timing, and efficiency rather than brute force, Sarah had developed capabilities that often surprised opponents who expected her to fight like a conventional military combatant. Meanwhile, in the men's locker room, Thompson was receiving encouragement and advice from Wilson and Chong. The three Marines had trained together extensively and had developed a strong camaraderie based on their shared experiences and mutual respect for each other's fighting abilities. "Remember, she's fast and she knows some kind of pressure point stuff," Wilson was saying as Thompson laced up his protective gear. "Don't let her get close enough to use those weird techniques she showed earlier." Chong nodded in agreement. "Keep your distance and use your reach advantage. You got at least 8 inches on her and probably 50 pounds. Don't try to be fancy. Just use your size and strength to overwhelm her." Thompson appreciated his friend's advice, but he was also beginning to have some doubts about the wisdom of this confrontation. His initial anger and wounded pride had given way to a more thoughtful analysis of what he had witnessed during the knife defense demonstration. Thompson had been in enough real fights, both in combat zones and in training environments, to recognize genuine skill when he saw it. The techniques Sarah had used were unlike anything he had encountered before, and the ease with which she had neutralized his attack suggested a level of training and experience that went far beyond basic military combat instruction. However, Thompson's reputation was now on the line in front of his peers, and backing down at this point would damage his standing within the unit. He had no choice but to proceed with the match and hope that his conventional fighting skills would prove superior to Sarah's martial arts techniques. As the two combatants emerged from their respective locker rooms, the crowd of spectators grew quiet with anticipation. Sarah walked calmly toward the sparring area, her expression serene and focused. Thompson approached from the opposite direction, moving with the confident swagger that had characterized his fighting style throughout his military career. Sergeant Major Collins stood in the center of the designated sparring area, flanked by 2 assistant instructors who would serve as referees and safety monitors. The rules he had established were straightforward. The match would continue until one participant was unable to continue, submitted, or was knocked unconscious. Medical personnel were standing by to provide immediate assistance if needed. "Before we begin," Collins announced to the crowd, "I want to remind everyone that this is a training exercise designed to demonstrate different fighting techniques and methodologies. Both participants are experienced military personnel who have volunteered for this demonstration." Collins then called Thompson and Sarah to the center of the sparring area for final instructions. "I want a clean fight with proper respect shown by both participants," he said formally. "You will follow my commands at all times, and the match will be stopped immediately if I determine that either participant is in danger of serious injury." Thompson and Sarah bowed to each other according to traditional martial arts protocol, a gesture that Sarah had requested and Thompson had agreed to out of professional courtesy. However, even this simple act revealed fundamental differences in their approaches to combat. Thompson's bow was perfunctory and brief, a mere formality that he was performing to meet the requirements of the situation. Sarah's bow was deep and respectful, reflecting the genuine honor she felt for her opponent and the opportunity to demonstrate her art. "Fighters ready?" Collins called out. Both participants nodded and assumed their fighting stances. Thompson settled into a familiar mixed martial arts position, feet shoulder-width apart, hands up in a defensive posture, weight evenly distributed for quick movement in any direction. His stance was aggressive and practical, designed for maximum effectiveness in a variety of combat situations. Sarah's stance appeared almost casual by comparison. Her feet were positioned in the traditional karate stance known as natural position. Her hands were relaxed at her sides, and her overall posture seemed almost meditative. To the untrained observer, she appeared to be completely unprepared for combat. However, martial arts experts in the crowd recognized what they were seeing. Sarah's apparently relaxed position was actually a highly sophisticated combat stance that allowed for instantaneous movement in any direction while maintaining perfect balance and body mechanics. "Begin," Collins commanded. Thompson immediately launched himself forward, using his size and reach advantages to press an aggressive attack. His strategy was simple and direct. Overwhelm Sarah with a combination of powerful punches and kicks while preventing her from using the close quarters techniques that had been so effective during the earlier demonstration. Thompson's initial assault was impressive by any standard. He threw a series of fast, powerful combinations that would have incapacitated most opponents within seconds. His technique was solid, his timing was good, and his physical conditioning allowed him to maintain a high level of intensity without fatigue. But Sarah was no longer where Thompson expected her to be. Instead of meeting Thompson's attack head-on, or trying to block his strikes directly, Sarah seemed to flow around his offensive efforts like water moving around a rock. She used subtle footwork and body positioning to stay just outside the range of his punches while simultaneously closing the distance for her own counterattacks. Thompson's first combination missed entirely as Sarah moved to his side with a circular step that brought her inside his guard. Before he could adjust his position, Sarah delivered a quick strike to a nerve cluster just below his ribs. The technique appeared gentle, almost like a light tap, but Thompson immediately felt a sharp pain and temporary numbness in his left leg. Thompson stumbled slightly, but recovered quickly, spinning to face Sarah and resetting his attack pattern. He was beginning to understand that this fight would not follow the conventional patterns he was accustomed to. What the hell was that? Thompson thought to himself as feeling gradually returned to his leg. She barely touched me, but it felt like I got hit with a baseball bat. Sarah had already moved back to a neutral position, waiting calmly for Thompson's next attack. Her expression remained serene and focused, showing no signs of aggression or emotional involvement in the conflict. Thompson decided to modify his strategy. Instead of trying to overwhelm Sarah with continuous attacks, he would use more measured, controlled strikes designed to test her defenses and identify weaknesses in her technique. His next assault was more cautious and tactical. Thompson used feints and misdirection to disguise his real attacks, throwing punches and kicks that were designed to force Sarah to commit to specific defensive responses that would leave her vulnerable to follow-up strikes. Once again, Sarah's response defied Thompson's expectations. Rather than falling for his feints or committing to obvious defensive movements, Sarah seemed to read his intentions before he fully executed them. She responded to his real attacks while ignoring his deceptions, as if she could somehow sense the difference between genuine threats and mere distractions. When Thompson threw a powerful right cross aimed at Sarah's head, she ducked slightly and moved forward, bringing herself inside the arc of his punch. At the same time, she delivered a precise strike to Thompson's wrist that caused his hand to open involuntarily and disrupted his balance. Before Thompson could recover, Sarah had moved behind him and applied what appeared to be a gentle push to his shoulder. However, the push was perfectly timed and positioned to take advantage of his off-balance state, sending him stumbling forward several steps. The crowd was beginning to murmur with amazement. What they were witnessing was unlike any fighting they had ever seen. Thompson, who had never lost a sparring match in his entire military career, was being systematically outmaneuvered by an opponent who appeared to be barely trying. Thompson's frustration was growing with each failed attack. He had trained extensively in mixed martial arts, boxing, and military combatives, but none of his knowledge seemed applicable to the situation. Every technique he attempted was neutralized or redirected, and Sarah's counterattacks were causing cumulative damage that was beginning to affect his performance. "She's making me look like a beginner," Thompson realized with growing anger. "This is impossible." Determined to land at least one solid strike, Thompson abandoned his measured approach and launched into his most aggressive attack pattern. He threw a rapid series of punches and kicks designed to overwhelm any possible defense through sheer volume and intensity. This time, Sarah's response was more dramatic and decisive. Instead of simply avoiding Thompson's attacks, she began to systematically dismantle his offensive capabilities. As Thompson threw a powerful left hook, Sarah caught his wrist with one hand while simultaneously striking his elbow with the other. The combination of controls caused Thompson's arm to hyperextend painfully, forcing him to abandon the attack. When Thompson attempted a high kick aimed at Sarah's head, she stepped inside the arc of the kick and applied pressure to specific points on his supporting leg. Thompson found himself off balance and vulnerable, with Sarah positioned perfectly for a devastating counterattack. But instead of pressing her advantage, Sarah simply stepped back and allowed Thompson to regain his balance. Her expression remained calm and respectful, showing no sign of triumph or aggression despite her obvious tactical superiority. The crowd was now completely silent, watching in awe as this small woman systematically demonstrated the inadequacy of conventional fighting techniques against true martial arts mastery. Even Wilson and Chong, who had been cheering loudly for their friend at the beginning of the match, were now watching in stunned silence. Thompson paused in his attacks, breathing heavily and reassessing the situation. His confidence was completely shattered, and he was beginning to understand that he was facing an opponent whose skills were in a completely different category from anything he had encountered before. How was she doing this? Thompson wondered as he tried to formulate a new strategy. "It's like she knows what I'm going to do before I do it." Sarah remained in her neutral stance, waiting patiently for Thompson to continue. She could see the confusion and frustration in his movements and understood that he was struggling to comprehend what was happening to him. From Sarah's perspective, the match was proceeding exactly as she had expected. Thompson was a skilled and experienced fighter by conventional standards, but his techniques were based on Western fighting concepts that emphasized strength, speed, and aggression. Against an opponent trained in traditional martial arts principles of balance, timing, and efficiency, those conventional techniques were largely ineffective. Sarah had no desire to humiliate Thompson or cause him unnecessary injury. Her goal was simply to demonstrate the effectiveness of proper martial arts training while maintaining the respect and honor that her father had taught her to value above victory. However, Sarah also understood that Thompson's pride and reputation were at stake and that he would not give up easily. The match was far from over, and Thompson's increasing desperation might actually make him more dangerous as he abandoned technique in favor of raw aggression. The real test was yet to come. Thompson's breathing had become labored, and sweat was dripping from his forehead despite the air conditioning in the training facility. He had been fighting for only 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every attack he had attempted had been neutralized, redirected, or simply avoided by his smaller opponent, who appeared as fresh and composed as when the match had begun. The crowd of spectators had grown to include personnel from throughout the facility. Word of the extraordinary demonstration taking place had reached every corner of the complex, and even senior officers had begun arriving to witness what many were already describing as the most remarkable display of combat skills they had ever seen. Among the newcomers was General Patricia Morrison, the commanding officer of the entire training facility. Morrison had served in the military for 25 years and had witnessed countless training exercises, combat demonstrations, and actual battlefield engagements. However, even her extensive experience had not prepared her for what she was observing. "Who is that SEAL?" Morrison asked Commander Patterson, who was standing nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the attention the match was receiving. "Lieutenant Sarafkin, Mang Patterson. She's here to help develop new close-quarters combat protocols. Her service record indicates extensive martial arts training, but I had no idea she possessed this level of skill. Morrison nodded thoughtfully as she continued to watch the match. Her trained eye could see what many of the other spectators might miss, that Sarah was demonstrating not just superior technique, but a completely different philosophy of combat that emphasized control and precision over force and aggression. In the sparring area, Thompson was struggling to develop a new strategy. Everything he had tried had failed, and his confidence was completely shattered. However, his pride as a Marine and his reputation among his peers prevented him from conceding defeat. Maybe if I can just get her to the ground, Thompson thought desperately. All that fancy footwork won't help her if I can get her in a grappling situation. Thompson decided to attempt a wrestling takedown, using his superior size and strength to bring the fight to the ground, where his mixed martial arts training might prove more effective. He feinted with a high punch and then dove forward, attempting to tackle Sarah around the waist. Sarah's response was swift and decisive. As Thompson committed to his takedown attempt, she stepped slightly to one side and placed both hands on his shoulders. Using his own momentum against him, she guided his trajectory downward while simultaneously stepping over his back. Thompson found himself face down on a mat with Sarah standing behind him in perfect position for a variety of finishing techniques. However, instead of applying a submission hold or delivering a strike, Sarah simply stepped back and allowed Thompson to regain his feet. The message was clear to everyone watching. Sarah could have ended the match at that moment, but she chose not to. Thompson stood slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. He had never been so thoroughly outclassed in any combat situation, and the fact that his opponent was showing him mercy only made the situation more humiliating. Why doesn't she just finish it? Wilson whispered to Chong as they watched their friend struggle to maintain his composure. Chong shook his head grimly. She's proving a point. She's showing everyone that she could end this anytime she wants to. Thompson's frustration finally boiled over into rage. Abandoning all pretense of controlled technique, he launched himself at Sarah with wild, powerful swings designed to cause maximum damage. His attacks were no longer calculated or strategic. They were the desperate assaults of someone who had lost control of both the fight and his emotions. This change in Thompson's approach actually made him more dangerous in some ways. While his technique had deteriorated, his increased aggression and willingness to accept injury in order to land a decisive blow created new challenges for Sarah to manage. However, Sarah's training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. Traditional martial arts instruction always included scenarios where practitioners had to defend against wild, undisciplined attacks from desperate opponents who had abandoned technique in favor of raw violence. As Thompson threw a series of haymaker punches with enough force to cause serious injury if they connected, Sarah began to demonstrate some of the more advanced techniques in her arsenal. Instead of simply avoiding his attacks, she started actively redirecting Thompson's energy in ways that would exhaust him while minimizing the risk to both participants. When Thompson threw a powerful right cross, Sarah caught his wrist with her left hand while simultaneously placing her right hand on his elbow. Using a technique known as entering, she stepped forward and to his side while maintaining control of his arm, forcing Thompson to overextend and spin to maintain his balance. As Thompson spun, Sarah maintained her grip on his arm and added a gentle but precisely applied force that guided him through a complete 360-degree rotation before releasing him. Thompson stumbled away, dizzy and disoriented, while Sarah remained perfectly balanced and in control. The crowd gasped at the elegance and efficiency of the technique. What had appeared to be a potentially dangerous situation had been resolved through skill and timing rather than force, leaving Thompson uninjured but clearly dominated. That was Aikido, observed Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, an Army officer who had studied martial arts during his college years. She's not just a karate practitioner, she's trained in multiple disciplines. Indeed, Sarah's martial arts education had been comprehensive. While her primary art was Shotokan karate, she had also studied Aikido, Judo, and traditional Chinese martial arts during her years of training. This diverse background allowed her to adapt her techniques to meet the specific requirements of any combat situation. Thompson was now breathing heavily and showing clear signs of exhaustion. His wild attacks were becoming increasingly desperate and uncontrolled, while his defensive capabilities had deteriorated to the point where he was essentially relying on his physical toughness to absorb punishment rather than avoiding it altogether. Sarah could see that Thompson was reaching the limits of his endurance, and that continuing the match much longer would serve no productive purpose. However, she also understood that Thompson's pride required him to continue fighting until he was clearly and definitively defeated. The solution, Sarah realized, was to demonstrate her capabilities so conclusively that even Thompson would be forced to acknowledge her superiority while still allowing him to maintain his dignity as a warrior. When Thompson attempted his next attack, a lunging combination of punches designed to corner Sarah against the wall of the sparring area, Sarah decided to end the demonstration decisively. As Thompson committed to his attack, Sarah performed a technique that would be talked about at the facility for years to come. Moving with speed that seemed to defy physics, she stepped inside Thompson's guard and delivered a series of precise strikes to nerve clusters and pressure points throughout his body. The strikes were delivered so quickly that most spectators couldn't follow the individual movements. What they saw was Sarah appearing to dance around Thompson for perhaps 2 seconds, during which time Thompson's aggressive assault simply stopped as if someone had turned off a switch. Thompson found himself standing in the center of the sparring area, completely unable to move. His arms hung limply at his sides, his legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and he couldn't seem to coordinate his movements enough to continue fighting. "I can't move," Thompson said quietly, his voice filled with amazement rather than fear. "What did you do to me?" Sarah bowed respectfully to her opponent before answering. "Pressure point paralysis," she explained gently. "The effects will wear off in a few minutes, and you'll experience no permanent injury. Your nervous system is just temporarily disrupted." The crowd erupted in applause and amazed conversation as the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Sarah had not only defeated one of the facility's best fighters, but she had done so using techniques that most of them had never even heard of, much less seen demonstrated. Sergeant Major Collins stepped forward to officially end the match, though the outcome had been clear for several minutes. "The winner by technical superiority, Lieutenant Chun," he announced formally. As sensation began to return to Thompson's limbs, he looked at Sarah with a combination of respect, amazement, and humility that had been completely absent from his demeanor at the beginning of their encounter. "I owe you an apology," Thompson said as he regained the use of his arms and legs. "I underestimated you, and I was disrespectful. You're the most skilled fighter I've ever encountered." Sarah accepted his apology graciously. "You're a skilled and courageous warrior," she replied sincerely. "I have great respect for your training and your dedication. We simply learned different approaches to the same challenges." But Wilson and Chong were not ready to accept the outcome of the match with the same grace their friend had shown. As the crowd began to disperse and Sarah started to leave the sparring area, the two Marines approached her with expressions that made their intentions clear. "That was impressive," Chong said, his tone suggesting that impressive might not be a compliment in this context. "But Thompson was tired from that long fight. How about you take on both of us while you're still fresh? Let's see if those pressure point tricks work against multiple opponents." Wilson nodded in agreement. "Yeah, fighting one guy is different from dealing with two experienced Marines who know what to expect." Sarah realized that the demonstration was far from over. While Thompson had been humbled by his defeat and was now showing appropriate respect, his companions still saw her victory as some kind of fluke or trick that needed to be tested further. Commander Patterson started to step forward to intervene, but General Morrison placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let's see how this plays out," Morrison said quietly. "This could be very educational for our training programs." Sarah looked at the two Marines who were now moving into position to attack her simultaneously. She understood that they genuinely believed their combined skills would prove superior to her individual capabilities, and she recognized that only another demonstration would convince them otherwise. "If you're sure that's what you want," Sarah said calmly, "then I'm willing to continue the demonstration." As Wilson and Chong spread out to attack her from different angles, Sarah prepared to show them that true martial arts mastery is not diminished by superior numbers. It simply requires more sophisticated technique and deeper understanding of combat principles. The most challenging part of the demonstration was about to begin. The atmosphere in the training facility had become electric with anticipation. Word of the extraordinary demonstration taking place had reached every corner of the complex, and personnel were abandoning their scheduled activities to witness what many were already calling the most remarkable display of martial arts skills in military history. General Morrison had positioned herself where she could observe every detail of the upcoming encounter. As the senior officer responsible for developing new training protocols for Special Operations Forces, she understood that she might be witnessing techniques that could revolutionize military combat instruction. Wilson and Chang moved to opposite sides of the sparring area, creating a triangle formation with Sarah at one point. Both Marines were experienced fighters who had trained extensively in coordinated attacks, and they were confident that their combined skills would prove superior to whatever techniques Sarah might employ. 2 against 1 isn't exactly fair, Chang called out to Sarah, though his tone suggested he didn't actually consider the odds particularly unfavorable to her. Sarah settled into her neutral stance and replied calmly, "In martial arts, we learn that fairness is not determined by numbers. It's determined by skill, preparation, and understanding." Wilson and Chang exchanged glances and nodded to each other. They had developed signals and coordination techniques during their years of training together, and they planned to use their teamwork advantage to overwhelm Sarah before she could employ the same mysterious techniques that had defeated Thompson. "Go!" Chang shouted, and both Marines launched simultaneous attacks from opposite directions. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed by military combat instructors for decades to come. Wilson approached from Sarah's left side, throwing a powerful combination of punches designed to force her to commit to defending in his direction. Simultaneously, Chang attacked from her right, using a series of kicks and strikes intended to capitalize on any opening created by her response to Wilson's assault. The coordinated attack was well executed and would have been devastating against a conventional opponent. However, Sarah's response demonstrated capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. Instead of choosing to defend against one attacker while leaving herself vulnerable to the other, Sarah employed a technique known in traditional martial arts as the eye of the hurricane. She positioned herself at the exact center of the 2 converging attacks, and then moved in a tight circular pattern that allowed her to engage both opponents simultaneously. As Wilson's first punch approached her head, Sarah ducked slightly and moved toward him, placing one hand on his wrist and the other on his shoulder. Using his momentum, she guided his attack past her body while simultaneously pivoting to face Chang's incoming kick. Sarah caught Chang's leg as it approached her midsection and used a technique called entering the void to step inside his guard while maintaining control of his captured limb. The combination of movements resulted in both Marines being off balance and overextended simultaneously. But instead of capitalizing on their vulnerable positions, Sarah released both opponents and stepped back to her neutral stance, allowing them to regain their balance and reset for another attack. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Sarah demonstrated that she could have disabled both attackers within the first 3 seconds of their assault, but had chosen restraint over domination. Wilson and Chang looked at each other with growing concern. Their best coordinated attack had been neutralized as easily as if they had been fighting a child, and they were beginning to understand that they were facing capabilities far beyond anything in their experience. "How did she do that?" Wilson whispered to Chang during the brief pause. Chang shook his head grimly. "I have no idea. It was like fighting smoke." However, both Marines were too proud and too committed to back down at this point. They had challenged Sarah publicly, and their reputations among their peers required them to continue fighting until they were definitively defeated. Wilson decided to try a different approach. Instead of coordinating with Chang, he would attempt to engage Sarah in close-quarters grappling while his partner provided supporting attacks. His extensive wrestling background made him confident in his ability to control a smaller opponent once he could get his hands on her. Wilson charged forward, attempting to tackle Sarah around the waist, while Chang moved to a flanking position to strike her if she tried to avoid the takedown. Sarah's response was a masterpiece of tactical awareness and physical precision. As Wilson dove toward her midsection, Sarah performed a technique called the void step, a movement that made her appear to simply vanish from Wilson's trajectory. One moment she was directly in front of him, and the next moment she was standing beside him as his tackle carried him harmlessly past her position. At the same time, Sarah was aware of Chang's position and movement pattern. As he moved to flank her, she timed her evasion of Wilson's attack to place her in perfect position to intercept Chang's supporting assault. When Chang threw a powerful kick aimed at Sarah's head, she was ready for him. Using a technique from traditional karate called flowing water, she moved with the kick rather than against it, allowing its energy to carry her into a position behind Chong while he was still committed to the attack. The result was that both Marines found themselves facing away from Sarah, with Wilson recovering from his failed tackle and Chong completing his kick against empty air. Sarah was positioned behind both of them with perfect tactical advantage and multiple finishing options available. Once again, Sarah chose to demonstrate restraint rather than pressing her advantage. She stepped back and allowed both Marines to turn around and face her, though by now it was clear to everyone watching that she could have ended the fight at any point she chose. "This is impossible," Chong said aloud, his frustration evident in his voice. "She's not human." Thompson, who was still recovering from his own match but had remained to watch his friend's attempt, understood what Chong was experiencing. "She's human," he said quietly. "She's just trained in ways we never imagined possible." General Morrison had seen enough to understand the implications of what she was witnessing. The technique Sarah was demonstrating represented combat capabilities that could provide enormous advantages to military forces if they could be taught to other personnel. "Commander Patterson," Morrison said quietly, "I want Lieutenant Chun assigned to my personal staff immediately. Whatever she's willing to teach us, we need to learn." In the sparring area, Wilson and Chong were preparing for what they both knew would be their final assault. Their pride as Marines demanded that they continue fighting, but their practical experience told them that victory was impossible. "One more time," Wilson said to Chong. "All out, everything we've got." Chong nodded grimly. They would fight with honor until they were defeated, regardless of the outcome. The two Marines launched their most aggressive and coordinated attack of the entire demonstration. Using every technique they had learned during their years of military training, they assaulted Sarah with a combination of strikes, kicks, and grappling attempts that would have overwhelmed virtually any opponent. Sarah's response was to demonstrate the highest levels of martial arts mastery, techniques that required decades of training to master and represented the culmination of centuries of warrior knowledge. Moving with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics, Sarah engaged both opponents simultaneously using a combination of techniques from multiple martial arts disciplines. She employed karate strikes for precision, aikido redirections for efficiency, and judo throws for control. The sequence lasted perhaps 10 seconds, during which time Sarah systematically dismantled every attack the Marines attempted while simultaneously positioning them for a series of non-injurious but decisive finishing techniques. When the encounter ended, both Wilson and Chong were face down on the sparring mat with Sarah standing between them in a position that demonstrated complete tactical dominance. However, neither Marine was injured. Sarah had used control techniques that subdued them without causing harm. As Wilson and Chong slowly regained their feet, the training facility erupted in applause from the assembled spectators. What they had witnessed was not just an impressive fighting demonstration, but a masterclass in the application of traditional martial arts principles to modern combat situations. Sarah bowed respectfully to both Marines, honoring them as worthy opponents despite the one-sided nature of the encounters. Her demeanor remained calm and humble, showing no sign of arrogance or triumph. "I have great respect for both of your skills and courage," Sarah said sincerely. "You fought with honor and determination. I hope this demonstration has been educational rather than discouraging." Wilson extended his hand to Sarah, his expression showing genuine respect and admiration. "Ma'am, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. I apologize for doubting your abilities. You're a true warrior." Chong nodded in agreement, still somewhat stunned by what he had experienced. "I've been training my whole life, and I've never encountered anything like what you just demonstrated. Would you be willing to teach us some of those techniques?" Sarah smiled warmly at the request. "Martial arts is not something that can be learned quickly," she explained. "True mastery requires years of dedicated practice and a commitment to understanding the philosophical principles behind the physical techniques. However, I would be honored to share what I know with anyone who is genuinely interested in learning." General Morrison stepped forward to address the group. "Lieutenant Chun," she announced formally, "I am immediately appointing you as the senior instructor for advanced combat techniques at this facility. Your first assignment will be to develop a comprehensive training program that incorporates the methods you have demonstrated today." The crowd of spectators began to disperse, buzzing with excited conversations about what they had witnessed. Many personnel approached Sarah to express their admiration and to ask about the possibility of training with her in the future. Thompson, Wilson, and Chang remained nearby, still processing their encounters with Sarah, but showing the kind of respect typically reserved for truly exceptional warriors. "Chun," Thompson said as the crowd thinned out, "I want you to know that this was the most educational experience of my military career. I learned more about fighting in the last hour than I had in years of conventional training." Sarah nodded graciously. "The greatest victory is not defeating an opponent," she replied, quoting one of her father's favorite sayings. "The greatest victory is turning an enemy into a friend and a challenger into a student." As Sarah left the training facility that evening, she reflected on the day's events with mixed emotions. She had successfully demonstrated the effectiveness of traditional martial arts principles, but she was also aware that her display might have humiliated capable warriors who deserved respect for their own skills and dedication. However, Sarah was gratified to see that Thompson, Wilson, and Chang had responded to their defeats with grace and a genuine desire to learn. Their willingness to acknowledge her superiority and ask for instruction showed the kind of character that made them worthy opponents and potential students. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began developing the comprehensive training program that General Morrison had requested. Her approach emphasized not just physical techniques, but the mental discipline, philosophical understanding, and ethical foundation that true martial arts mastery required. Thompson, Wilson, and Chang became her first students, approaching their training with the humility and dedication that their experiences during the demonstration had taught them. They discovered that learning martial arts was far more challenging than they had anticipated, but also far more rewarding than conventional military combat training. The story of Sarah's demonstration spread throughout the military community, becoming legendary among special operations forces and combat instructors. However, for Sarah herself, the most important outcome was the opportunity to share the knowledge and wisdom that her father had passed down to her. Years later, when asked about the incident during a television interview, Sarah would reflect on the true meaning of the confrontation. "That day wasn't about proving who was the better fighter," she explained to the interviewer. "It was about demonstrating that true strength comes not from the ability to defeat others, but from the wisdom to know when fighting is necessary and the skill to end conflicts with the minimum amount of harm to everyone involved." The interviewer pressed for more details about the specific techniques she had used, but Sarah declined to elaborate. "Martial arts is not about the techniques themselves," she said with a smile. "It's about the person who uses them and the principles that guide their application." The real lesson of that day was not about fighting. It was about respect, humility, and the transformative power of genuine understanding. The legacy of that demonstration continued to influence military combat training for years to come. Sarah's methods were studied, analyzed, and incorporated into training programs throughout the special operations community. However, the most important impact was on the individuals who had participated directly in the encounter. Thompson, Wilson, and Chang went on to become exceptional martial artists in their own right, eventually teaching other service members the techniques and principles they had learned from Sarah. More importantly, they carried forward the philosophical lessons about respect, humility, and the true nature of strength that their defeat had taught them. Sarah Chun continued her military career, eventually retiring as a full colonel after serving with distinction in multiple combat deployments and training assignments. Throughout her career, she remained committed to the principles her father had taught her, using her skills not to dominate others, but to protect those who needed protection and to teach others the path to genuine mastery. The day when 3 confident Marines had challenged a quiet SEAL and learned the difference between fighting and martial arts became more than just a memorable training incident. It became a testament to the power of traditional knowledge, the importance of humility, and the transformation that occurs when warriors encounter something greater than themselves. In the end, everyone involved in that confrontation emerged as better fighters and better people, proving that sometimes the most valuable victories are the ones that teach us about our own limitations and show us new paths to growth.